few of my own comments. First of all, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. My name is Steve Clemens. I run the Foreign Policy and National Security programs here at the New America Foundation, and I am thrilled to be working today with Democracy, the Journal of Ideas. This is a fantastic new journal. I'm going to show it where we have lots of folks watching live online right now, and I want to thank Clay Ryden and Mike Tomasky. Where's Mike Tomasky and Clay? Where's Clay? Clay's not here yet.
Clay's out of town, but here's Ethan Porter, associated.
Okay, great. Well, thank both of you for both the article that was published and the debate that I think it is going to stir. But thanks for co-sponsoring today's program with us at the New America Foundation. And thank you all for coming to our new facilities. I'm wondering if there's like 20 or 30 people at our old spot. It takes a while, that lag. But this is one of the first meetings that we've had in our new offices here, and we're trying to make everything work. So far, we haven't heard the toilet flush, but you can hear it go right open with the speaker through the pipe. But anyway, glad we're live online today. The Autonomy Rule is what we're here to discuss today, a fascinating take on how to frame American foreign policy moves down the road by Adam Mount and Charlie Kupchan. Many of you know Charles Kupchan. He's Professor of International Relations at Georgetown University, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He was Director of the Motara Center for International Studies at Georgetown, a Director for European Affairs in the National Security Council, a former member of the Policy Planning Staff at the U.S. Department of State. I've known Charlie for a long time, and I'm one of his great admirers. What I find really interesting about Charlie wrote a great book, and I don't know if it's here. It's called The End of the American Era, U.S. Foreign Policy and the Geopolitics of the 21st Century in 2002, which meant you were really writing in 2000, 2001. So it beat by about 7 or 8 years the national intelligence estimate on the future of U.S. power, because he really laid it out in quite fascinating detail. I was part of the Council on Foreign Relations study group at that time, and I kept saying to Charlie, stop pulling your punches, go harder. He actually wrote a very sober book looking at the question of the tectonics of global power and then we're going. And at the time, I think Charlie was hedging his bets just a little bit, had a great title, but he hedged his bets various places in the process. But then he didn't realize that the Bush administration would speed up history, because he was looking at sort of a 2 or 3 decade long period, and to some degree, I think Charlie was on target much sooner. And you'll remember that I was the lone voice that kept saying to go faster in your thesis, Charlie. We can get back to that later, but it was a lot of fun. But I think that he'll get that. And Adam Mount, who is the co-author of this important article, is a research assistant at the Council on Foreign Relations and a graduate student at Georgetown University, already very well published, and recently wrote with Charles Kupchan The Next Order. I guess it's in the next issue of Democracy Journal, a Journal of Ideas as well. And we've asked 2 people. We had originally advertised David Frum from the American Enterprise Institute, a good friend of ours who's been at New America Foundation frequently. David, regrettably, this morning had a personal issue that he couldn't avoid and helped line up for us his great friend Eli Lake. His stand-in, I think Eli will be no less vociferous in providing at least an alternative view or a friendly critique of this article. Eli, you'll all know, is a senior national security reporter for the Washington Times, served in a similar role with the New York Sun. I don't often tell people this. We've enjoyed many a concert now and then on Central Park in New York. I usually kind of keep my neoconservative friends hidden in my life, but someone saw us. So Eli is a friend, but he's also a jousting partner in the world of ideas. And we have Rachel Kleinfeld, who's done a magnificent job over the last several years founding and building the Truman National Security Project. She's a bioterrorism consultant at CSIS, working with Richard Danzig. Has been a senior consultant with Booz Allen and Hamilton, but really, for the Democratic Party, has been a key player in helping to build a pool of expertise and a network, particularly of young people, writers, thinkers, and intellectuals, trying to scope out how Democrats deal with the military, essentially, and the provisions, the deployment of power, and how to conceptualize it. It'll be very interesting because what we've assembled here today, while Rachel's been working primarily, I should say, with the Democratic Party. I think that's fair, right, Rachel? I know you say you're bipartisan, but nonetheless. I think it is important to recognize why Rachel and Eli are here, and also in response to what Kupchan and Mount have done. In my view, and I should put on the board that Charlie doesn't like the way I conceptualize the importance of this paper. This paper is a direct response to 2 other leading players and thinkers in the field about the way in which what the future debate, the future contests are going to look like. Bob Kagan at the Carnegie Endowment has written compellingly about what he would call the absolutists versus the liberals, that the next great battle is going to be between a dividing line between countries like ours and the UK, Europe more broadly, Japan versus Russia, China, totalitarian regimes. And so absolutism and totalitarianism versus liberal democracy. And some of this framing has been captured in the concept of the concert of democracies. To some degree, the concert of democracies was an idea promulgated and pushed forward by two people who now reject it, John Eikenberry and Anne-Marie Slaughter. Anne-Marie is now, of course, running policy planning at the State Department, who themselves now agree with some of the adherents that it's a Trojan horse for killing the UN and undermining some of American engagement in international institutions. But what I find interesting is that Charlie and Adam Mount are also replying to John Eikenberry and Daniel Dewdney and others who have been arguing that the liberal order has become such a permanent and ongoing and strong fixture that regardless whether America remains predominant in it or not, other ascending powers will not only fill that space and fill out the muscle and tissue and sinews of that liberal order, they will want it because it's built, it's easy, it's benign, and it helps them advance their interests. And what I find interesting, and I've been struggling with it, if you believe today is a moment of historical discontinuity, and we ought to be thinking not about what to do tomorrow just in Afghanistan, but what to think about 30 or 40 or 50 years from now, how do you reconceptualize where we're going, what sorts of strategic direction makes the most sense? In a sort of Dean Acheson moment sort of way, I've been struggling with this notion of how the United States can generate a network of responsible powers in the world, and what does responsibility mean, and are they all going to look the same? And I've had trouble conceptualizing it or articulating it. I've written about it a bit on my blog, The Washington Note, and then I read this article, and so my bias is in the Adam Mount, Charles Kupchan camp, that the Autonomy Rule gets a lot of this right and does, I think, a beautiful job of dealing with the question of how do you create a framework for responsible behavior, responsible management, stabilization down the road without necessarily appeasing bad guys and foregoing our responsibilities as the sort of unique state we are in trying to promulgate in a competitive environment about what the kind of liberal democracy we have today. So it's a very provocative piece, particularly appearing in this journal, an important journal, but it's not every day one sees something that promotes autonomy as opposed to democratic practice, etc., broadly in this journal. So without further ado, let me ask Charlie Kupchan and Adam Mount to share their ideas on their own without my tilting them one way or other, and then I will ask for responses from Eli Lake and Rachel Kleinfeld. Charlie Kupchan.
Thank you very much, Steve, and let me offer my gratitude to you personally, because you've been a strong backer of this article and a bunch of ideas that I think we share in common over the past few years, but also New America for hosting this. I think you guys have succeeded in establishing yourselves as the venue of choice in Washington for getting out fresh and new ideas. So Adam and I are pleased to have our first public debate about the article here at New America. Let me also thank Democracy and Ethan and Mike for not just publishing the article, but pushing us on various fronts while we were working on it and doing the due diligence on the editorial side. But also I want to sort of come back to something Steve said at the very end of his introduction, and that is that this article sort of came about when I got a call from Ken Baer, who's no longer at the journal, and said, "Charlie, I want you to write a long review essay. I don't even remember what the books were about. Will you do it?" And I said, well, let me get back to you. And called him back the following week, and I said, I don't really want to do that review essay, but I have another idea. I want to write this article with a co-author, Adam Mount. It's going to be about autonomy and why we need to get away from democracy as a defining idea in the international system. And I hear Ken's wheels beginning to turn, and I'm paraphrasing him, but he basically says, so you're saying that you want to write an article for a journal called Democracy that essentially says that everything we stand for and everything that we are as editors is full of bull. And I said, yeah, that's basically what I want to do. And he says, I'm going to have to get back to you. So I say, oh, well, nice try. And then I get a call about 5 days later, and he says, yeah, we're going to do it. And I don't know anything about the editorial intrigue of democracy and who was for it and who was against it, but we're simply delighted that in the end of the day, the editors saw fit to publish the article in the journal. And finally, let me thank Eli and Rachel for taking the time to come over this afternoon and deeming the article worthy of a little bit of verbal battle. I'm going to do two things in the next 3 or 4 minutes. One is just tell you a little bit about where this article came from, and then give you a quick sketch of the article as a whole. And then I'm going to turn it over to Adam, and he's going to drill down a bit on this idea of autonomy, its intellectual foundations, why we believe it is a better concept for organizing the next international system than liberal internationalism and the aggressive promotion of liberal democracy. And then he'll also say a few things about some of the policy implications of the analysis. This article, I think, grew out of two things I was working on over the last couple of years. One was a book that I just finished about rapprochement. It's called How Enemies Become Friends. And I went into that book thinking that I would find that regime type, democracy, liberal democracy, would be an important indicator of when long-standing rivals are able to find their way to peace. And that's because we are led to believe by the academy and by policymakers in this city that regime type matters, and that democracies are uniquely suited to pursue peace and to fashion international partnerships. And in many ways, it's that principle that is the basis for liberal internationalism, the founding principles that have guided American foreign policy since the meeting between Churchill and Roosevelt in 1941 off the coast of Newfoundland. Well, I didn't get what I expected in that book. I found that regime type really doesn't matter that much, and that lots of different kinds of regimes can practice strategic restraint and make friends with each other. And so I began to think, as a product of that book, maybe democracy is overrated as an indicator and as a defining concept for organizing the international system. And that then led me to publish an article late last year in Foreign Affairs critiquing the idea of a League of Democracies in which regime type would be the defining characteristic. And Adam entered at that point and helped me on both the critique of the League of Democracies and the book I was working on. And I remember one day in my office when we sort of finished the League of Democracies critique, we looked at each other and said to each other, well, if it's not democracy, what is it? You can't just write a piece that says, don't do this. You have to have some thoughts about what we do instead. And we grabbed a legal pad and we started ruminating about what the next international order might look like, what its norms might be. And that doodling on the legal pad ended up as the article that you have in front of you today. One final comment. Steve, in an email he sent around yesterday and in his introduction today, called this global Nixonianism. And I think it might be easy to see this piece as a post hoc rationalization of realism. And it is not meant to be that. We can have a debate about realism and its pros and cons. Certainly it makes sense from a realist perspective for the United States to work with Russia and China and Saudi Arabia, because we need them in ways that we have not before. But our purpose was not simply to say, let's gravitate to realism. Rather, it was to say, let's have a debate, a normative debate, about moral issues, about the normative principles that would underlie the next order, and that would give what might be a more realist American foreign policy a moral and a normative compass. And we believe that it is better to move to an international order that is based upon a set of normative principles, even if more realist in flavor, than simply to move toward a competitive anarchy in which countries are motivated by a starker conception of national self-interest. And so to some extent we really wanted to reshape the debate. which has been polarized between neoconservatives who essentially want to destroy non-democracies and liberal internationalists and liberals who want to seduce non-democracies and bring them into the tent. And we're trying to say that there is a middle position. There's something in between those two poles that is an important intellectual move to pushing American foreign policy in a way that is still based on important normative principles, but begins to let go of the insistence of liberal democracy as the defining principle of the international system. Let me now just quickly give you a sense of the core issues in the article, and then I'll turn to Adam to say a little bit more about what we mean by the autonomy rule. The conventional wisdom among liberals, and I think Adam and I both identify ourselves as liberals, is that the international system, the Western order that has been put in place by the United States, working in cooperation with Japan and its West European allies, is the right international system. And yes, American primacy and Western primacy may be waning, but what we now need to do is simply take this international system and universalize it, open the door, let Russia and China and Saudi Arabia take their seats at our table as they meet the standards. And we're saying that it's just not going to work that way. That the Western liberal international order is not, as some might say, an order crafted behind the Rawlsian veil of ignorance. That is to say, that it is not an order that meets the needs and the welfare of all states. Different countries pursue welfare and their interests and the welfare of their citizens in different ways. They don't necessarily want to do it our way. And so, in trying to figure out what that next order is going to look like, we believe that it is one in which the West will have to give as much as it gets. That it will have to fashion a set of principles which are not uniquely Western, but nonetheless based upon a set of moral principles which are negotiated between democracies and non-democracies alike. One thing we know from history is that when major powers rise, they don't simply fit comfortably into the pre-existing order. They like to change that order in ways that suit their interests. And so we believe that as India, as China, as Russia, as Brazil, as Indonesia rise, they are not going to walk through that door and take a seat at our table. We're going to have to find a new table, renegotiate those principles, and come together on a set of norms that will anchor the international system. We offer autonomy as the concept to move toward in anchoring that system. And we believe that states should be accorded the rights of good standing, that is to say, brought in as members of the international community in good standing, when they act and govern so as to enhance and protect the autonomy of their citizens, the ability of their citizens to improve their lives, the ability of their citizens to realize their aspirations in a manner consistent with their preferences. And rather than focusing on liberal democracy as the litmus test of who's in and who's out, we believe that one should focus on responsible governance, the ability of governments to honor and respect the welfare of their citizens. We believe that different countries take different paths to honoring the autonomy and welfare of their citizens. Liberal democracy is only one such path. Indeed, there are different versions of liberal democracy. Some that are much more focused on individual rights and freedom from state intervention, and some conceptions of liberal democracy that are much more communitarian, that focus much more on enabling individuals to overcome the unfreedom that is caused by poverty and deprivation. And so we believe that one has to be pluralistic and tolerant, not just about different conceptions of liberal democracy, but about different conceptions of responsible governance more broadly. We then generate three ancillary principles that we see as following from this broader notion of autonomy and responsible governance. And those three principles are, first, a return to a more traditional notion of sovereignty. Adam and I defend the so-called responsibility to protect because we believe that countries that are predatory, that don't honor their citizens, like North Korea, like Burma, like Zimbabwe, should not be accorded the rights of good standing. Indeed, they should lose their rights to sovereignty in the same manner that Kofi Annan and others have suggested. But short of that, we argue against a diminution of a traditional notion of sovereignty, that is to say, preventive wars waged to extend democracy, because we see these as more threatening to the international system than an investment in its stability. The second ancillary principle that we generate is regionalism. We believe that instead of creating a League of Democracies or turning NATO into a global alliance of democracies, the West should enable others to fend for themselves, that the West should serve as a model for ASEAN, for the GCC, for the African Union, for the defense union taking shape in South Africa, to do for their own regions, in their own way, what NATO and the EU have done for the West. Lock in peace and stability. But they should be able to do that according to their own norms and their own cultures. But we should not assume that the international system will derive legitimacy from transatlantic consensus, and that the West will continue to serve as the anchor of the normative order. And then the third and final ancillary principle that we generate has to do with diversity of not just political life, but of economic life. And we believe that the Washington consensus is probably gone for good as a result of this financial crisis, and that the West needs not just to tolerate different forms of responsible government, but different forms of economic management. And we're probably heading toward an international system which is less enthusiastic about free trade, more willing to accept state intervention in the marketplace, and more focused on making globalization more equitable, that is to say, closing the gap between winners and losers. Adam.
So, my thanks to Democracy and to Steve and Rachel and Ryan, Charlie are all undiminished, and so I'll spare you the run through again. But they are just as authentic. Charlie gave us a good run through of the article, so I want to drill down slightly and give you some more nuanced conceptions of what's entailed by the Autonomy Rule, sort of its intellectual history, where it comes from, without being too theoretical or too tedious. So one of the things Charlie mentioned was that there are aspects of the article that are amenable both to how realists think about the international system and American foreign policy, and how liberals do too. And this also combines with a third set of principles which are grounded in the morality between states and the morality of American foreign policy interests. Which isn't to say that either Charlie or I are realists in any description of the term, and neither are we neoconservatives.
Speak for yourself.
We also have very different perspectives on these things. And so one of our hopes was, as Charlie and I kind of tried to negotiate the article and figure out what was acceptable to both of us, we also hope it has a broad appeal to a number of different factions out there in Washington. And so I say some of this to try to forestall some of the criticisms later, if it ever possible. And so the way that it tries to do this is by trading on kind of an interesting pun in how we think about autonomy. Autonomy, in the sense that we use the term, isn't the autonomy of non-intervention against government encroachment. Right? It's not a libertarian autonomy. It's not an autonomy just in the sense of freedom from. Rather, we're trying to use autonomy in the sense that classical political theorists like Kant used it. And in this sense, it's freedom from, it's the ability to self-govern. Autonomy in this sense is, autonomy is self-governance. And so in this sense, it sets up what I called just now an interesting point. So when we're looking for autonomy as self-governance, it could mean different things in different contexts. So it builds into its own definition a flexibility relative to the different conditions that it faces. So in this sense, autonomy can mean different things. For some states, for some peoples, for some nations, autonomy might well mean that libertarian sort of autonomy. It might mean freedom from government intervention. And so in these cases, there are some states on the face of this planet, regrettably, that are overbearing, that do encroach too much on the private lives of their citizens, on their ability to pursue their own economic interests. And in these states, it might well be, right, this sort of freedom from intervention in the government that pursues the ability of citizens to self-legislate, to define their own destiny through the world. But it could just mean the opposite. So in some states that are racked with poverty, in some states that are facing economic trouble, that are stuck in a liquidity trap or a poverty trap, as Jeff Sachs would say, then you might think that autonomy requires exactly the opposite conception. So in these senses, autonomy might mean an expansion of government services. It might mean provision of a national education system. It might mean provision of basic services. And this is the sense in which Amartya Sen, who talks about providing for the capabilities of citizens themselves. And so you can see what Charlie and I are doing as an analogous move to the one that Sen did for international development, in trying to refocus American foreign policy and refocus how we think about governments on the citizens themselves and the welfare of the citizens themselves. The bargain that Charlie and I make is that it's the moral thing to do. It's the right thing to do because it provides for the welfare of citizens. It provides for their ability to determine their own lives. But it also is in our self-interest, in American self-interest and in the self-interest of the governments themselves, because it builds a more stable world. It builds a world in which the United States is respected by all those citizens subsequently. And we hope that that's the case. The other point I want to make is that when we say something, as we do in the article, that sometimes respecting the autonomy of foreign citizens is respecting their choice of government, then we try to build into the article a mirror image about how we should conduct American foreign policy. So the argument here was that rather than assuming that Western liberal democracy is the sole way to pursue the autonomy of citizens, we think recently the United States and other Western liberal democracies have shown some defects. We're not at the end of history. We haven't succeeded in perfecting the practice of governance. And so when we try to push that conception of government on foreign peoples, it can do just as much to encroach upon their autonomy as sometimes authoritarian citizens can, as long as those populations they may not have chosen those governments like China, maybe like Russia, maybe not like Iran. Maybe they haven't chosen them in the sense of free, open, fair, democratic elections that meet the standards of liberal democracies. But if those governments if they're consistent with the preferences of their populations, then for the United States to dictate a certain form of government, it actually does serve to encroach upon the autonomy, right, the ability of self-governance of those populations themselves. So it builds in this mirror image in that it not only says, like we were concerned in the article, to provide basic minimal standards for inclusion into the international order. It not only does that, but it provides guidance for American foreign policy. So in other words, the basic rule is all states who adhere to the Autonomy Rule, who better the welfare of their citizens in a manner consistent with their preferences, should be included as full and equal members of the international community. That's part of it. and that's the basic standard for inclusion. But we might think that those states that apply the autonomy rule above and beyond this very basic premise are praiseworthy, right? Not only do they meet the standards for inclusion, but they do something even better if they serve to apply the autonomy rule in their dealings with foreign citizens. Thank you. So, in other words, insofar as the United States, it provides a standard for U.S. policymaking on a day-to-day basis, in evaluating different policies and considering whether to take this action or that action. The United States could just as well do something like apply a global autonomy rule. Does this action promote the autonomy of foreign citizens? Does it not? It could be used to ground liberal notions like an expansion of poverty aid or poverty alleviation. It could be used to define realist notions of acceptance of authoritarian states and working together to help confront the challenges that we all face. But either way, we hope that by providing these tools, by providing this intellectual framework, we've helped to place both camps of people on the type of footing that they can sustain their arguments, that they can defend their arguments, both from a moral point of view and a self-interest point of view, and see that these things really aren't incompatible.
Thank you so much. We'll then have Eli Lake up to bat.
Well, first, thank you very much. Thank you, Steve. It's wonderful to be in your brand new digs, which is beautiful, unique space. And it's fantastic to have an article. It's this meaty to get to delve into. I have enormous respect for Dr. Kupchan, and I've just met Adam Mount, and I'm thrilled to be talking about this. I am going to be quite strong in my criticism. I disagree very strongly with the article, but I'm glad to have an article of this caliber to disagree with, so thank you. Charlie started off with a beautiful metaphor of all of the countries that need to be at the table, coming to the table, sitting down, and working out a new global order. And that sounds beautiful, except that, as we all know in foreign policy, there's no table. There's an endless set of two-person meetings outside of a door, of gatherings in hallways, of the G20, the G7, the G8, ASEAN, EU, APEC, et cetera, endless sets of groupings and regroupings that create our global order. There's no God-given table that we all sit down at, and there's certainly no American table that we all sit down at. Insofar as that's the case, we will need a set of different rules, many different places where we're going at any particular point. However, that doesn't mean that we give up an overarching rule. The unfortunate part is that the autonomy rule is somewhat warmed over Asian values and cultural relativist arguments from the 80s, and is a real dangerous capitulation to the failures of the past 8 years of the Bush administration. Bush administration might have used the flag of democracy to justify policies that represented no learning over the past 30 years, none of the learning that we've gained from the third wave of democracy promotion. But that's no reason the rest of us who had learned those lessons should throw in the towel and give up both our belief in basic rights and our power, which is what this rule would represent. ICS is at a moment of rare opportunity. It is an inflection point when what is needed for America is to reclaim a number of these values that we've lost thanks to Abu Ghraib, thanks to Vice President Cheney's defense of torture and so on. And instead of saying our power is declining, let's give up some of the power we have left, to say our power is declining, what do we do to regain some of the power that we've lost and reset a stable world? So there's three main points I'm going to make. First, the autonomy rule claims that in eschewing democracy will instill a new rule of welfare, which sounds very well and good. It's all in the name of greater world stability. The problem being it's incoherent. Autocracies are extremely fragile systems. The vast majority of evidence shows that democracy is much better at establishing welfare. And so you get to welfare through democracy, not by giving up democracy. Second, the autonomy rule suggests that America will be less resented, that it'll be more realistic, that we'll get along better with other powers if we give up this heavy-handed, moralistic phraseology within our foreign policy. And I certainly agree that we should be showing a lot more respect to the rest of the world, and that the way the Bush administration pursued its democracy policy represented a huge step back from how we should deal with the world. However, to offer autonomy with this conception of welfare at its base as a stand-in for democracy simply gets us back to the same place. It's another norm. It's going to cause the same amount of resentment. Slightly different cast of characters will be resentful. They hide the ball, they change the name, but in doing so, they manage to give up some of our deepest values. Finally, the Autonomy Rule suggests that we don't want to give up our fundamental beliefs, but we really have to, because there's a decline in power, we're declining power, the economy is declining, et cetera, et cetera. First, I think it's false. I think the relative decline of power of the U.S. might end up less. We might deserve it more, but we might end up with less of it. We're not an export-based country. But also, there's no reason, because our power is declining, to give up our soft power. And the call of democracy and rights, the fundamental rights that we stood for, is a huge element of our power, and not one that you give up just because you're losing other elements. So let me go to take each in turn for just a minute. First, there's the old canard, do you promote welfare, do you promote democracy? And I thought Amartya Sen set this to rest, and the Democracy Advantage, which just came out in its second edition, set it further to rest. Just to go very quickly, I'm not going to recount the democratic peace theory, but democratic governments are much more likely to prevent state failure, which is a lot of what the Autonomy Rule circles around, is this failure of states to provide for their governments. What occurred in Somalia, and Bosnia, and Liberia, Afghanistan in the 1990s, a lot of the state failure problems are caused by a lack of democracy, and there's actually no democracy that has gone through a total state failure in that way. Autocracies also generate the massive refugee crises. Over the last 20 years, we've had 40 major refugee crises, 36 of them have been autocracies for democracies. If you care about the welfare of citizens, this is an important bullet point. Rule of law, which is a key feature of democracy, according to everyone who studied it over the last 30 years, not according to President Bush, accounts for as much as 47% of economic growth in countries that have been studied worldwide by the Democracy Advantage. That's where that number comes from. And democracies tend to have a 1% GDP advantage over autocracies, particularly if they're low-income democracies, which is particularly interesting if what you're caring about is the welfare of your citizens. In other words, it's very hard to divide development from democracy, because democracy allows for a fair divvying up of spoils. But it's more than that. Democracy also allows for the fair working of differences among political groups, and as anyone who's worked in developing countries knows, there's nothing that's more harmful to development than war and conflict. That destroys development, and from a stability perspective, the data is even stronger. It hasn't been low income that led to the Algeria of the 1990s, the Iran of the 1979, the Muslim Brotherhood of the 1960s, Philippines under the Marcos dictatorship. All of these insurgencies and counterterrorism problems, many of which we're still dealing with today, were caused not by the lack of income, but when a government decided to fail to support a democratic outcome in those states. That's when you got these sorts of insurgencies and troublesome ideas that are still causing problems that are keeping those countries back today. Everyone knows the stats on democratic peace, but the issue is really about, is there an outlet for legitimate grievances? And that's why political democracy is so important over and above the welfare issue. The stability gained from democracy is gigantic. You don't have a single point of failure in a non-resilient system, as we would say in the security realm. You don't have a Musharraf that a single assassin's bullet can kill and destroy, and then you have a major power breakdown. You have institutions, you have a rule of law, and you have multiple players competing. It looks much more chaotic. In reality, it's much more stable, and it allows for slow, steady gains rather than large spikes. And recent studies by the World Bank and by development leaders have shown that it's the spikiness of a lot of development that actually causes more problems for development gains. So to paraphrase Ben Franklin, you give up democracy for welfare, it sounds good, you get neither. Point two, will the U.S. be less resented if we support autonomy rather than democracy? Certainly, we need to be less respectful. I think about this, we need to be more respectful. I think about when I lived in India, in Eastern Europe, rural India. There was a place where women were served last, if they were served at all. The women in the villages I lived in would all stand behind the table. The honored guests would eat, then all the men would eat the leftovers, then the women would get to eat the leftovers from that. As an honored Western guest, I was considered part of the first group. And it was rude to say, well, let's bring the women in here. But I could do my part within that respectful setting to say, why aren't the women getting to eat at the same table? Can I invite a couple of them to sit next to me so I feel more comfortable as a woman? That's the way you respectfully disagree with the system of norms that you dislike. And I think it's similar for democracy. It hardly changes the equation if you have a system of norms that says support welfare rather than democracy. Why is this? Well, if you think of democracy as forcing people to give up power, welfare forces people to give up rents, corruption, etc. And that's just as difficult for rulers to give up. And you're asking the same thing of them, where they're giving up power, they're giving up rents from corruption. They'll be equally resentful. They're equally resentful of any system that would keep some group from the table and some group not from the table. So you get the same resentment. You don't get the gains. Also, there's been a number of issues that Charlie and Adam carved out. So they carve out a responsibility to protect from their sovereignty rule. They carve out issues of terrorism from their sovereignty rule, at which point it just sort of melts down into incoherence. It doesn't become a useful rule. It's a fundamental logical flaw. Finally, why should we pick a democracy of democracy and not welfare? Well, one part is a measurement issue. A poor government has a lot of trouble delivering welfare. If you're Bangladesh, I just got back from Bangladesh last month, or 2 months ago, it's very difficult for the Bangladeshi government to deliver welfare. It's a poor, poor country. It is not hard for a government to deliver some level of democracy. And it gives a bar that all countries have an ability to pass. As some might have a poorer democracy than others, some might have more difficulty with the rule of law than others, but they can show that they're making gains whether or not they have the money to actually deliver welfare to their people. And that's an important difference. That levels the playing field in an important way. The Autonomy Rule declares that a country in good standing will be a country that seeks to improve the lives of its citizens in a manner consistent with their preferences. But how do you judge those preferences when there's no democracy? Big problem. This brings me to the third and final point about soft power. Countries the world over, when you ask the people what they prefer democracies. Now, not every single one. There's interesting evidence that in Pakistan they might not. But the vast majority do. When I was in Bangladesh, I was there for their elections. They were moving away from a military government and picking between two extremely corrupt and poor democratic governments. And in line, the women kept saying to me, well, yes, we know that we're going to have a worse government than we had before, but we're here to vote anyway. The voting was far over 75% of the population. There was a dignity that came from having the right to vote, a dignity that they wanted to choose to have, despite the fact that they thought their welfare was going to be reduced from that vote. The soft power of America standing for women like that in the line, of standing for people who want the right to determine and have political voice, is an immense power that we've wielded for 100 years. John Gaddis writes about this power. I have a quote on my desk from the founder of Bertelsmann, the German foundation, who was a POW in an American war camp in Kansas, and says that he wished he could have stayed in America. He was forced to go back as a German POW, but that what he learned about democracy and rights was all that he brought back to Germany from that experience. We have immense soft power that we risk giving up just at the moment when we should be taking it back and holding up America. Now, the final point, and I'll close with this, is we've learned a lot about democracy in the last 30 years over the third wave. CSIS recently published a paper of leading experts talking about stability and democracy, and they sum it up much better than I can, so I'm just going to read their lines. Democracy is a long, complex, ultimately indigenous process, not an end state. It requires seeking gradual and serious progress, not just elections. And indigenous actors must take the lead. The U.S. has to be much more humble and much more pragmatic in how we help them out, but ultimately it's an indigenous process. That's what we've learned over the last 30 years. It's not been what Bush learned, but it has been what many of the rest of us learned. And I see no reason to capitulate to 8 years of bad governance by giving up what's governed us well for 100.
Thanks, Rachel. Eli Lake.
Thank you very much. Let me start off by saying what I liked about the essay. which is that you appear to be supporting the notion of second and third class international citizenship. And then you write, any country that perpetrates or tolerates genocide, enable or allows the systematic persecution and physical abuse of minority, exposes its citizens to widespread privation and disease, will fall well short of meeting the autonomy rule. Bravo. And you also say that this states in good standing are expected to honor not only the autonomy of their own citizens, but also, through their statecraft, the citizens of other countries. Respect for the political decisions of foreign citizens is part of the requirement, but so is the prohibition of policies that threaten the security and well-being of other states and their populations, which I think gets us, at least from my, I think we're back to rogue states with that. And that's a good thing, because the international system as it is right now is very much broken. And one of the reasons it's broken, I think, is because of an excess of respect for closed systems. And what do I mean by that? From a very practical perspective, forget what we like as idealists or as Americans. When we have negotiations on arms control, or for that matter even trade agreements, with closed systems, they tend to not work out very well in our favor. And one need only look at the history of negotiations with North Korea. One need only look at the recent arms control and nuclear talks with Iran between the EU3. One could look at property rights discussions with the Chinese. And while I don't think any neoconservative or any conservative would argue at this point for a shooting war with China, I think it's perfectly reasonable to simply say that for an international system to work that provides collective security, you need to have agreements with states that you can reasonably expect will honor their agreements, A, but also democracies have the advantage of a kind of transparency and also a kind of political pressure that closed systems don't. And what do I mean? There's no there's no federal register in Iran. We have no idea what that government is doing, and they go to great lengths to deceive the rest of the world about what they're doing. And the other thing I would say is that does anyone here have any doubt that if you could truly have free elections in Iran, that the majority of Iranian people, I hate to sort of harp on that, would vote for a reformist candidate like that would want a better relations with the West? And one of the things that having a system that's grounded in the notion of democracy can do is that it allows us to use methods of coercion for bad actors, short of war and short of hard power, that can be really effective, because democracies have elections, and it's, you see all the time that that populations will respond, I think, to the censure, not to mention the sanction of these governments. So I think that the international system is very broken right now, as we see programs like Oil for Food in Iraq don't work because we punish a population that the leadership of Iraq obviously had an interest in having been punished. But had Iraq been a democracy, I don't think they would have been in Kuwait, based on what Richard Kleinfeld said on democratic peace theory. But I think you would have, if you had been in that situation, 6 weeks of the kinds of sanctions that the Iraqis felt would probably have forced a change in government. And so these, I think, are important factors to consider. Finally, I would just want to make a point about American domestic politics. This is a very provocative essay, but I would think it's very difficult for a member of the Senate or a presidential candidate to talk about this as American foreign policy. Americans tend to care and tend to believe that our values are universal, and they'd like to see it emulated in other countries. And this has been a fact of American political life for a very, very long time. And I think it's one of the reasons why Gerald Ford lost, because he embraced détente, because amoral foreign policy is something that at least has not had a very good track record in our own domestic politics, not to mention that Americans freely organizing will often rush to the defense of Tibetans and other minorities that are under the boot of these closed systems. So I think that there is a kind of political impracticality about this sort of foreign policy here. And finally, I would just ask a couple of questions. I see our current international system, 2/5 of the UN Security Council are unfree. So we have a foreign policy that deals all the time. China owns probably the largest stakeholder of our national debt right now. So in some ways, we do have an international system that accommodates, works with unfree states, and we kind of go along. Now, if this Autonomy Rule is making a minor point about democracy promotion as U.S. foreign policy, I would join you and say that we should do what works, and perhaps organizations that are private, like the Open Society Institute from George Soros in the 1990s, were very effective without being part of a U.S. government strategy of supporting liberal Democrats in the former Soviet republics of Central Asia. And I think we could say that the success that we saw in Georgia in some ways is due to the investments made 10 years earlier by Soros and others, and there's no reason why private efforts like that could not be the primary means of democracy promotion, especially considering how many of the people we most want to help in countries that are closed systems are now persecuted and arrested and accused, in some cases, of treason for accepting money from the National Endowment for Democracy or the rest of the Ned family. So I'm open to a kind of discussion about the tactics of democracy promotion, which is important. But as a sort of anchoring of our foreign policy, I think that in some ways it's politically difficult here. I don't know, and I wonder if this is going to lead to the kind of functioning international system that we currently lack. That's what I'd say.
About a pragmatic approach, a softer approach to that, which I think, from having read this paper very carefully, actually, I'll wait for Charlie and Adam to say, but I think falls very closely with something that would work within their system. The whole idea is they're not forfeiting the notion of democracy promotion or even trying to sort of promote the notions of democracy within a competitive framework. The question is, what are the bars for international coordination? And I think in terms of a global Nixonian approach, which I did call this, it lowers the bar for a lot of coordinated action, and it promotes the question of what sorts of basic norms you're going to move. And I actually think that you helped their argument. But what do you think? Do you think they helped your argument?
I think Eli actually helped.
Eli, a partner.
I'm not so sure about Rachel. I think that's slightly harsher critique, and I would just come back.
My critique was harsh.
It was.
I didn't like. I mean, there were a lot of them.
You liked the piece. To Rachel, I'd basically say three things. One is that there is a debate, and we have to join it about American power, the trajectory of American power and the trajectory of the West. And I think that we just disagree. And I think that most power indicators suggest that we are on a downward trajectory in relative terms. Not that we're not going to be number one for the next few decades, we will, but that we will not enjoy the global predominance in GDP or military capability that we have in the past. And so you can say, well, let's just rebuild it. And my response is, well, that ain't so easy when you're in debt up to your eyeballs and when we can't really affect the growth rates in China and in India and in other parts of the world. So, and this is simply, we can have an empirical debate about it. Second point I'd make is I think you actually caricature our argument and saying, we're just sort of, let's just throw into the dust heap our values. And we're not saying that at all. In fact, we say repeatedly throughout the article that we believe in democracy. We like democracy. We think democracy is the best of the alternative systems of government. And we actually believe that it will ultimately prevail, because it will outperform the alternatives in the end of the day. And so what we're saying is not, let's just give up on democracy. What we're saying is, let's practice a little bit what we preach. And at home, we tolerate difference. We tolerate different conceptions of the good. We tolerate diversity and pluralism. In fact, we believe that it is the best way to get political solutions to difficult problems. So why should we be diverse and pluralistic and tolerant at home, but much less so abroad? And so our view is that by no means give up on democracy, but realize that different countries will take different paths in the pursuit of the good. And let's be a little more tolerant about different conceptions of how to get from A to B. Another point I'd make is I think you, in stating the advantages of democracy, go a bit too far. And I think your the data is there. But I would point out a few other things. One is that why some autocracies do better than democracies. And one of the reasons that China has outperformed India on many different indicators, education, health, economic growth, is that China is an autocracy and India is a democracy. So in some circumstances, more centralized control leads to more welfare, not less. Second point, I'm not so sure that I have the same experiences when I travel as you do. That everybody is sitting around, and if they had to choose between a bowl of rice or a ballot, they would choose the ballot. In fact, I think most people in the world would much rather have the ability to get ahead economically and provide for the welfare of their family than they would go up the street and cast a ballot. If you look at the public opinion data, the last poll taken arguably before the economic crisis, 83% of the Chinese public think their country is headed in the right direction. 23% of Americans feel that. If you look at public opinion in Russia, what percent of the Russian population wants to move to liberal democracy? I was looking at some numbers recently. I think the answer is 4, but I would have to confirm that. So let's be a little bit more humble about what it is that other people want and how much we think we have found the solution. Finally, I just fundamentally disagree with you that to pursue the kinds of policies that we're talking about, we lose soft power. I think we gain soft power. The rest of the world thinks that we're up on this bully pulpit, slapping them around and telling them what to do. If we actually take a more relaxed position, realize that there are different ways of pursuing autonomy and welfare, I think that our respect and our legitimacy overseas will go way up, not way down. And so in that sense, I think you've simply turned around one of the important things that we have to say. And then finally, just a quick comment to Eli. I agree with you on the domestic front. That I don't think that Barack Obama is going to give a speech tomorrow night, which he says, yes, the autonomy rule. But I do think that it would be useful over the long run to try to change the discourse in this country away from some of these sort of defining nodal points that we've sort of glomped onto, towards something that is more respectful of alternatives, and that recognizes that the United States will not have the global sway moving forward as it has in the past.
I want to open the floor for you, if you're comfortable with Charlie speaking for both of you. And I think what's interesting, and I hope we do get at it, because I think having Eli and Rachel both here is important, that to some degree, this is a comment about values, militancy, and foreign policy. And what I was intrigued to hear from Eli is a much more flexible approach to that question than I heard from Rachel, because I do think that there's a growing narrative in Democratic Party circles, Democratic foreign policy circles, that George Bush and the neoconservative team advising him got it wrong. But Madeleine Albright and the sort of values militants that she represented in regime change with Serbia, Milosevic, et cetera, they knew how to get the kind of neoconservative agenda right. And it's very interesting. And you've seen the sort of more realist traditions in both parties in decline, and the more how do we mess within the DNA of other countries in a more militant way rise and succeed. And I sort of see that in both. But I saw in Eli's comment, a bit more pragmatism, and I applaud that. The one thing I'd add, during Jamie Kirchik is from here from New Republic somewhere, and I had a debate, a friendly civil debate with Richard Just of the New Republic during the campaign over Hillary Clinton's comment that George Bush should boycott the Olympic game opening ceremonies because of China's behavior in Tibet and Darfur. And I wrote at the time how unpresidential that was, how miserable it was, because neither would it solve the problems in Tibet or Darfur, but it was a PR stunt essentially designed to fail at a very clear moment of psychological shaping about the international system and China's views on stakeholdership at a key point. Oh, and by the way, we need them on nuclear non-proliferation support, the currency, climate change, and a whole variety of other issues. And we had a very interesting debate that I think captured a lot of this, and I would encourage people to go take a look at it. But it does seem to me that we get lost a little bit, and like Charlie Trent, in PR stunts regarding how to affect change abroad rather than results-oriented actions, be they military or even be soft power, however you'd like to define it, that might engender it. And I think may take us back to some of the Soros stuff that Eli talked about, is that there may be other ways that fit quite well with the autonomy rule that nonetheless can help engender indigenous, grounded, rooted democratic transformation. But let me open the floor to others. This gentleman right here, and then we'll go to Mike Lind. Yes, sir.
Scott Thompson.
Yeah, he's gone.
I very sympathetic with the autonomy model, but I live in 2 Southeast Asian countries, and I want to add a question about the world that is not only has no table, but does have leaders who are very idiosyncratic about their perceptions of things. And I've watched in the last few months how, in the country I mainly live in, the Philippines, a leader's husband is very quick to steal a lot more money in anticipation of a new administration in Washington and harsher attitudes towards her, while she tried 4 end runs to try to see the new president, failed on all of them. And in a softer way in Indonesia, and I'm also looking at what happened in the Middle East with the war that ended very conveniently just before the inauguration. And I'm wondering if the last statement, that you were saying that the gain in soft power from your model is not a little bit too strong. Leaders are looking at what's going on, what's this other guy in Washington thinking, and how's it going to affect me? And it's terribly central to all the leaders in the world that I deal with.
John? Yeah.
I think that's right, that you are in a situation now where every country is asking, how's this going to affect me, or how's this going to affect us? And that, but I still do think that to the degree that the United States can make a choice about selling itself as the beacon of democracy and basing its engagement abroad on that, versus a more nuanced and respectful approach to different kinds of regimes, I would argue firmly on the latter, to enhance our soft power. The one area, and I'll just put this out on the table because I'd rather it come from us than from you, where I think we are in most trouble, and the beginning of your question, you alluded to this, is in the gray states. And there are going to be lots of them. Pakistan, for example. Countries that are still rent-seeking and a little bit predatory, but it looks like their governments are sort of interested in the welfare of their citizens, but they keep taking money and killing or imprisoning people for their political views. We struggled with this. We thought about putting something in the essay on this, and we decided to duck under the table. But I think it is admittedly one of the issues that I think you were touching on, that we would welcome any input on how to deal with.
But we're dialing down, even with Pakistan, Afghanistan, some of our objections. One of the other things is the autonomy rule. If you believe that we're now changing course militarily, you give cover to the Obama administration's lower expectations, right? If I were to be a critic of what you're doing.
As Carlos Lozada put it in the
Mike Lind.
Post, that's right.
Right, Mike Lind.
Thanks. I think the interesting thing about this article is that it's not Nixonian. I want to challenge Steve on this. That it's an attempt to have a different moral legitimation from democracy promotion, instead of simply rationalizing expedience. And in that connection, if you're going to characterize it, I would call it Carter-Reaganite. I don't know if you all in the sense that Jimmy Carter and then Ronald Reagan, in reaction to Nixonian Kissingerian realism, emphasized human rights. And the premise was that you could have a regime could respect human rights, even if it did not have multi-party democracy. It would be better if it did, but not. So my question for the critics is, in some ways, isn't there a distinction between values that you promote that can be achieved by a regime if that regime simply stops doing something that you object to? Religious freedom, basic human rights, rule of law. In other words, you stop persecuting people, you stop jailing people, but you could, even if you're running a non-democratic regime. And it seems to me, in that sense, the human rights approach seems like the autonomy rule. It does not require the regime to resign. It can stay in power, it just quits doing something. It seems to me democracy promotion requires many regimes, presumably that's why they're undemocratic, to resign, as opposed to simply to quit doing a particular practice.
What you're getting at, Mike, too, is something Richard Haas has talked about the difference between sort of that sort of set of institutions, the human rights of it, as opposed to ballotocracies and voting, which I think my friend Rachel focused a lot more on elections and political choice, not about institutions in that environment. So,
well, Michael, first of all, I agree completely. I think Carter Reagan is the perfect characterization because this is not Nixonian. This is a separate type of rights-based, norm-based belief system. Part of why I object to it so much is that it's so close. You always object more to things that are almost there. I think the characterization of democracy as ballotocracy is 20 years old still. I mean, come on. For 30 years now, we've looked at how you promote democracy, and no one argues for elections as the main way to do it. It's institutionally based. Now, when I think about your points about is human rights, is it democracy, what are the exact issues? At a certain point, it all gets fuzzy. I mean, at a certain point, we all agree that you want welfare, you want some political voice. The question is kind of how do you get there? And the reason that I think it's important not to throw democracy out is that some process of citizenry being able to make their voices and votes known to a government in a regularized way is a very important way of getting there and keeping the government honest and on the right path. You see democracy after democracy in Africa over the last 40 years that started out a conformist, welfare-seeking government that had toppled a poor, corrupt, unfortunate government, who then get heady with power and continue a non-democratic, supposedly welfarist regime. And that's the danger of taking the welfare and not taking the democracy. And I think it's an important danger.
I would simply say on the 20-year question about Richard Haas in his last book, actually, that I quoted him, he did actually make that comment that the Bush administration got quite confused about ballotocracies versus what is democracy. That is, so maybe he's 20 years late, but that nonetheless was the spear that he threw at the administration for which he previously worked. Yeah, real quick.
On that, Richard Haas is drafted and developed the main democratization program for the State Department in his first term as the head of policy planning, MEPI, the Middle East Partnership Initiative, which the very premise of which that closed family-owned states in the Middle East would voluntarily relinquish their authority, which is, I think that there's an inherent incoherence to that. And while there were times that Bush talked about democracy in a way that sort of talked about it as a democratic revolution, there was very little follow-through. I mean, there were occasionally times when Condoleezza Rice pressed the Egyptians to let out political prisoners, but then there were other political prisoners who weren't. I mean, so a lot of it was mainly rhetoric. And a change from the Bush administration would be if there was a coherent actual policy, that looked at results in a serious way on democracy promotion. I would just say that one thing that you have to consider, and I tend to fall on the democracy freedom side of this equation, is that if you really want democracy in our client states in the Middle East, and if you really want democracy, then that in some ways is an embrace of instability in the short term to get you stability in the long term.
I'm gonna cluster some because there's no other way to get to anyone, and there are too many powerful people who will dislike me. So right here, but we're not going to answer right away. So start taking notes. And we're going to make it brief.
Yeah, George Hall. I'm a professor at Virginia Tech. Joe Biden at the Munich conference said that the United States does not respect other countries having a kind of sphere of influence. And so I wanted to ask you about that, whether this also means that you respect spheres of influence of other states, particularly Georgia, Ukraine, Taiwan, and those types of issues. And if you do go to that kind of older geopolitical notion, how do you handle that in a world where one of the structural features of the geopolitical condition is global media and the ability to take local crises and those crises to jump scale become kind of polarizing for the system as a whole, as we saw in August with South Ossetia?
Thank you. Right here. And we'll go to Harlan.
Hi, Andy Loomis, Brookings Institution. I found myself a little depressed reading the article, partly because, Charlie, your earlier work, I wonder if you're giving up on the socialization project that you were about as early as 1990, right? So, and also, I mean, the point, I guess, the central point is that the bright line between democracies and non-democracies is inherently fuzzy in this struck by the autonomy rule. It's not clear, like, who's in and who's out. You're supporting democracy, but yet you want a more broader welcoming of a broader range of regimes. And so the question I have is, are we really talking about the wrong thing? Are we really talking about the style of our foreign policy and how we approach other states, rather than whether or not democracies is an inherent good? I wonder if it could be taken up, some of your concerns could be taken up by a different approach.
We need to have drinks. I was very excited as I read the article. Harlan?
I was rather impressed by the optimism expressed by the panel, because it just seems to me you have either downplayed or ignored the potentially catastrophic economic and fiscal meltdowns we're facing, as well as the strategic ones. You take a look at Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, North Korea, the Middle East under new leadership in Israel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it seems to me that this discussion is irrelevant.
I think Charlie called it a downward trajectory.
I think that's very optimistic, Steve. And so it seems to me the discussion really misses, if indeed we are in the midst of multi-crises, which many of us do, how you really deal with them. And it has this marvelous debate about democracy and other means that it seems to me just does not apply to the crises we're facing right now.
Let's just do the quick John Glenn and Ms. Baker.
Thanks very much. Very provocative, guys. It's really helpful to get this debate going. One diagnosis, one sort of your conclusion. You begin the article, and many of this is premised on what you say, the U.S. after World War II enjoying dominance of 7 centuries in the global sphere. And I found myself thinking, really? I thought we were in a bipolar Cold War until 1989. I don't think we had dominance. And I took Eli's comment about, and during that time, our international institutions had Russia and China having a seat in our UN Security Council. So in some ways I felt like that raised a flag on my mind to think, what are we really diagnosing the problem here? And I found myself, again, actually echoing, I think in some ways our critique is of the rhetoric of the Bush administration rather than their policies. Did they engage China? Sure. Did they isolate Russia? No. Did they do these sorts of things? And so sure, they used this idea that the U.S. was the beacon of democracy, but I didn't see it. One short point about where it goes. I worry that this is sort of what may be seen as a false choice between development and democracy. And it's a choice that you see debated in the development and the foreign aid literature in an interesting way, in which they've over years said, well, for a while we want to just be about reducing poverty. We're not political, we'll just give money to reduce poverty in poor countries. And that's what we're focusing on. And in recent years, they've really brought into question whether or not that was possible to do that. And they led them to the notion that's very close to what you use about, we want good governance. But whenever I've asked those folks, what do you mean? They say, well, we want just rule of law, accountability, transparency. And I go, wow, okay, that sounds like democracy to me, that's close enough. And so how different is it really if you're accountable to your populations, if the rulers are subject to a genuine rule of law, meaning an independence? I mean, I just find myself wondering, how far is that really?
I have a much lower bar than all that, but yes, that's him right here. And then I promise to come back to the other side.
Mary Speck. I study Latin America, and I was wondering, and this seems to be a formula for dealing with stable states. I don't understand how this would apply to unstable authoritarian states or fragile democracies. We've certainly seen in the past of the United States becoming identified with dictatorships, even if it chooses to think that it was not, because of investments, because of maintaining diplomatic relations, and that has discredited us with the opposite. And how do we help fragile democracies that may not be doing a very good job at maintaining the welfare of its citizenry?
Charlie?
On George's question about spheres of influence, I think that when Biden used that terminology, it was a code word for we will continue to aspire to Georgian and Ukrainian membership in NATO. Because he also followed it with, and states will be able to choose their alliances freely. I think in our view, what we're thinking about is not a world in which China and Russia and Indonesia and Brazil have sort of unadorned spheres of influence, but in which what you have gotten in the European context is about as good as you can get. That is, if you can get major regional powers to embed themselves in some kind of norm-governed regional framework, then spheres of influence become much more benign than if they are simply big, great powers that are ruling over their immediate neighbors. So I think that in the section where we deal with regional devolution, the idea is to try to create replicas of one sort or another of the regional experiments that have worked in North America and in Europe as a way of building stability and good governance in other parts of the world. There was Harlan and I think John and Andy, your questions kind of merge in the following sense that I agree with Harlan, and this kind of comes back to an exchange that Rachel and I had, and that part of my rationale, I don't know about Adam, because I think you would agree with this, for this kind of move, this intellectual move, is we need to lighten the load. Our economy is in deep trouble. We've got 2 wars going on, neither of them are going particularly well. We need to move toward an international system that will be one that is somewhat more self-sustaining and autonomous, to use the word autonomy, because we need to get our own house in order. So this is in part a way of saying the United States is moving to a position in which it is going to be stingier, politically and geopolitically. And this is a recipe that helps us get there. So that's an added benefit. On style versus substance, I think both of you were getting, I think you said rhetoric versus policies. I mean, I would say that yes, but if in fact that's the case, let's cash in on it. Right? If in fact we are going to work with China and Russia because we have to, let's stop being hypocritical. Let's recognize that we're going to do that, create a set of norms in which we will do that, and then we may actually get a norm-governed international system. As Steve likes to put it, the bar is going to be much lower. But having that norm-governed system with the bar lower is a hell of a lot better than just living with hypocrisy and living with these principles that we're simply not going to implement. Finally,
let me just jump into that. I think that's a good point, in that it's fair to say that there's a difference between rhetoric and policy. But that's why I disagree with the rest of the panel, is that it's not difficult to talk about this as American foreign policy, because it's, in practice, I think this is what we put into play. We do deal with China, we do recognize them. It's a very difficult argument for a U.S. politician to say a country that's brought 300 million people out of poverty, right, the population of the United States in the last 15 years, isn't respecting the welfare of its citizens. I think we do this in practice, and so the hypocrisy, the tension between how we talk about pushing democracy and what we actually do really does put strain on our foreign policy. So if we talk like we behave, this is a way to think about doing that in a manner that's, and this is where I disagree with Rachel, absolutely consistent with American values.
So quickie, just a quick, the largely symbolic meetings that a president or a secretary of state will have with Chinese dissidents, or a resolution about the disappearance of journalists in Russia, is that really such a drag on our diplomacy? You just want to get rid of that?
I'd like another two-finger on that, in that China, of course, has done amazing work on its welfare, but it gets down to talking points. Does the talking point about dissidents and human rights get into the Secretary of State's remarks? I know when Hillary Clinton went over there, this was a huge fight where one part of the State Department kept taking it out and another part kept putting it back in, and they had this huge internal debate about that talking point. That's what we were doing. This is exactly what this comes down to. But
do you think Hillary's position during the campaign about urging Bush to boycott the Chinese opening game ceremonies was a correct position for her to have taken?
Personally, I actually think it should be. I mean, I come from a human rights background.
But the question is that you're willing thus to forfeit.
Let's look at what China did right at the games. First of all, they said they were going to have an area of allowable protest. They then went and arrested everyone who submitted a paper saying we would like to be part of this area of allowable protest. They arrested and jailed an old man, I can't remember, 76, 84 years old. I mean, yes, they brought 300 million people out of poverty. I'm not denigrating that reality. They also operate the largest system of prison gulags for political prisoners in the entire world. This is a troublesome state, and I don't want to pretend that one negates the other. They're both important.
But it is interesting that you supported that position. I'm rereading right now Chernow's book on Alexander Hamilton, which my blog readers know. I'm sort of saying, wow, do you remember this? Reading it very closely. And what's interesting is that Hamilton was getting at this tension between sentiments and interests early on in the Republic. We're having the same debate today about sentiments and interests to some degree. And I think what Charlie and Adam have put on the table is a conceptualization that is not alien completely to sentiments. It just lowered the bar and realized that interests drive behavior more. But we've seen in the last 8 years, both in the Democratic Party, I would even add the Clinton administration, last 12 to 16 years, the rise of a sort of sentimentally driven.
Steve, it doesn't say if you boycott China in the Olympics, which is a purely rhetorical, grandstanding gesture. It doesn't say you don't talk with China. China's a very pragmatic, rational country. So do you say to them, look, we strongly disagree with this area of your policy. We're going to work on climate change. You own a lot of our debt. When our economy implodes, yours implodes even worse because you're an export-based country. I mean, these are real things. They're going to come to the table on these things. And it comes down to how you discuss them.
Yeah, can I just add one minor point on this? What are we talking about? We're talking about totally symbolic gestures on the sentiment side, and then real politics on everything else. There's no real. When has the U.S. government done anything other than talk or give a speech or have a meeting to express a policy with regard to human rights in China or Russia? I mean, there was, I guess you could say, in the end of the Cold War, there was the Jackson-Bannock Amendment. Right. But that's the last time I can remember an actual policy, like, beyond the realm of a speech or a meeting. So, I mean, would you like to just get rid of all that? Is my question to you.
Right here. Let's just jump around the room quick. I've got to end by 1:45. So yes.
Norman Bailey, Institute of World Politics. First of all, I want to strongly object to a 76-year-old man being considered extremely old. Secondly, the major problem, in my opinion, of this very interesting and provocative article is that it attempts to establish a general rule. And general rules are always a problem because then you have definitional problems. Is A over here, B over here, C over here, or is it the opposite or whatever? The simpler a general rule is, the easier it is to apply. And between the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the First World War, which was one of the most peaceful centuries in the history of the world, I mean, more people died in the American Civil War than all of the international wars put together during that period. The simple rule was that if you don't threaten other countries, you can damn well do whatever you want to inside your own country. And if you applied that rule, for example, you would exclude North Korea, which threatens other countries all over the place, but you would not exclude Burma, which is a repressive regime that doesn't threaten anybody.
Right here.
Thanks, Jeremy Sturchio. This is a really sophisticated intellectual debate, so my question might seem a bit rough, but basically it strikes me that the American formula has been two-pronged, at least, for success, and that is a democratic political system with a free market economic system. And I wondered if, I didn't get a lot of detail in the Autonomy Rule's conceptualization of what are the norms for economic systems. I mean, we're having a debate about the moral relativity of political values, but if we look at American history, the democratic political system has been closely tied to success of free market capitalism. And so this, I think, begs the question, when we're moving forward into a period where the fundamental bases of free markets are being called into question by some, but the implication in your example, for instance, with India and China, where you said that China's a better bet because look how easily they can do things, and India's not a good bet because they're all tied up with these regulations. That presumes that China's buying into this free market equation. And so the question there would be, over the long run, would you rather have India with a democracy working toward freer markets, Or would you rather have China with a capitalist policy, but they're not democratic? So that's the question.
I'd want an ally. I've got time for one more. Mike?
Yeah, I'm Mike Olshausen. This is a question for Adam Mount. If you just think of all the many countries in the world, and there are about 160 some odd countries, as exemplars of your autonomy rule, whether they do it well, whether they don't do it very well, where would America rank? Would it be first? Would it be 20th? Hong Kong is first for business. Singapore is near the top, they're about 13th, 14th, according to the Financial Times. And would there be any in the top tiers, in the top 10, that are not now democracies, as you understand that word?
Very interesting. Let me make before I open this, we've got to finish up in 5 minutes, but Foreign Policy Magazine has just moved into space adjacent to ours, and they're very good with lists. You know, the 20 top think tanks, which we're on the list, but low. Other lists, but it is very interesting in terms of how whether you've thought through, and maybe Democracy Journal and FP want to get together and begin looking at ranking the 180 states in terms of who would be in, who would be out, and comparing them to the John Eikenberry list or the Ivo Daalder Concert of Democracies versus, say, the Bob Kagan list. So I'm giving the graphics people out for these journals an idea. But let me ask Rachel and Eli to make any final comments they'd like in reaction or your own thoughts before we close, and then give Adam and Charlie the last word.
Just to answer a couple of questions that have come up that I felt didn't get answered. First, on the Westphalian sovereignty issue. I'm actually, despite being a human rights activist, quite sympathetic to the idea that in a perfect world, the Westphalian idea probably saved the most lives and harmed the least. And if we could do it, even though it seems to fly in the face of everything, all the beliefs, from a utilitarian standpoint of what works, I would do it. However, we're in a different sort of world now, and I think too many of our problems are generated within states rather than between states, so that if there's a health crisis of tuberculosis that's drug resistant in Russia, that's our problem. It's not just their problem. If there's a state that is generating bioterrorism, Aum Shinrikyo in Japan, that becomes our problem. It's not just their problem. There's too many problems now that cross state boundaries to allow those rules to hold, even if we're just talking about national security. So while I wish it can't be on the money issue, we're in a whole new ballgame. No one has any money. We've lost about a third of global wealth, maybe more than that at this point. I checked the time. Over the last couple of months. And that's not coming back anytime soon for any country. So does this mean we devolve to regions? Well, I think absolutely it means we share the burden. But the fact is, Charlie and I were just at a dinner of Euro MPs where I kept saying, you know, I'd love to give Europe more money and more space for its own defense mechanisms, because we can really use them to have their own defense mechanisms. They don't want to put the money into their own defense mechanisms. Africa doesn't want to put the money in. We are still the ones who drive this. And so if you're going to devolve, you still need to look at where's it coming from. And it tends to come from us. We're still the world leaders.
Okay. Eli?
I want to hear that.
Okay. Adam?
Well, thank you for the question. That's an excellent question. And the long and short of it is that there's no global exemplar of the autonomy rule. There's no perfect country. The State Department just released a report of a major omnibus human rights report, and the only country that wasn't included, Canada was, Switzerland was, right, discussing all of their infringements, was the United States, which isn't surprising in the slightest, right? But we haven't been through and decided precisely who's in, who's out. Probably the closest thing you could point to is something like the Human Development Index, which was discussed. So maybe it wouldn't take new quantitative indicators. But just to respond to something that Andy Loomis said earlier about whether or not democracy is an inherent good, I think it is. I think absolutely it is. And I think Amartya Sen furthermore was right to say that democracy is a human right. It's a universal good. But of course, I'm going to say that. I'm an American. And so the socialization bargain that Charlie and John Eikenberry inaugurated presumptuously in the literature in 1990 is based on the idea that this is a norm that has feet, right, that's transportable, and that other countries see as morally just. And if that's not the case, then democracy might be good, but pushing democracy might be bad. It might do more to harm American soft power and American moral authority than it does good. And so there's a way that you can say, to build a more stable world, to build a more democratic world in the long run, you need to set the United States up, to give it the tools, to give it the moral authority, to respectfully compete with other forms of democracy. And the way to do this is to put us on firmer moral footing.
Final thoughts?
Yeah, on your good question about the concert of Europe in the 19th century. Here I line myself up with Rachel in the sense that that bar is too low. In that, to say that we put such a value on interstate cooperation that we just don't give a damn about what goes on inside states seems to me to simply go too far. And our hope is, and this may be naive, but I don't think it is, that if you exclude ambiguous cases and focus, and this comes to some extent to your question, those egregious cases where states are falling apart, where there are failed states, where there is a loss of life on a huge scale because of famine or because of genocide, that you may actually do a better job of dealing with those states in the world that we're talking about than you do now. Because you're not fighting about autocracy versus democracy, who's in and who's out. You narrow down the number of states in which unacceptable behaviors are taking place, and hopefully thereby build a consensus among powers of different regime types that that kind of outcome is unacceptable. On the economic norms, I think my answer would be I wouldn't choose either. I would simply say that the Chinese model of authoritarian capitalism is one way to pursue welfare and responsible governance. The Indian model of chaotic democracy is another way. Right now, the Chinese model is outperforming the Indian model. But I would say that both of them deserve the respect of the United States, even as we would criticize them publicly on Tibet, on human rights, on the way they handled dissidents during the Olympics. So our view is let reasonably responsible states alone to pursue their independent paths to welfare, and let's, while they're doing that, treat them with the respect that they deserve, and as a result, hopefully they will treat us with the respect that we deserve.
I think this is a vital debate to have, and I'm very pleased that John Eikenberry and Daniel Dewdney, when their piece in Foreign Affairs came out, offered to give a talk here, and we had Dimitri Symes, and who was, I can't remember who the other respondent was at the time, laying out some counterpoints. Others like Fareed Zakaria, Anne-Marie Slaughter, Kishore Mahbubani, Parag Khanna have also been putting their stakes out in this extremely important debate. And of course, I mentioned Robert Kagan before with his important thinking and work. And I do think that it's not only useful and a casual thing to sort of think about how are we going to frame the international system as you look decades out. But I also think that in the near term, from my own perspective, which is so close to Charlie's, is that the mystique of American power has been somewhat punctured. Limits have been shown, a global equilibrium has been thrown out of balance, and we have to figure out to some degree how to reacquire that mystique, leverage, etc. So I find myself subscribing fully to what Charlie has been done. I've been trying to, there's a new book, I'm mentioning a lot of these for those watching online, and I'll put links online for all of these resources. But the Stanley Foundation has commissioned a book which will soon be out on looking at sort of stakeholder behaviors, going from that famous Bob Zellick speech about China and responsible stakeholdership in the international system, and beginning to think that through not so much in the China sense, but applied to Iran, Brazil, Japan, and others. And I've co-authored the Japan piece in this, but it made me think about, would it not be a better way for America to sort of have as its benchmark for behaviors, engagement and disengagement, the degree to which you can cultivate responsible stakeholders and define what that means, which comes in. And I've been saying, maybe we need something like, maybe not the autonomy rule, maybe that's one way. Another way is stakeholder internationalism. There are lots of ways to do this, but I really applaud Democracy Journal, a journal of ideas, and Charlie Kupchan and Adam Mount for this provocative essay. I thank Eli Lake and Rachel for providing such great context in this debate, which is a fair one, a civil one, an important one to have. So thank you all for joining us, and meeting together.